Sometimes, despite our best intentions, you might make a mistake that leads to your well-laid plans all coming to nothing. You know what? Don't worry. It happens way more than you might think, even to people who on the surface look like they've got their acts together. Hell, even video game heroes mess up from time to time, although in their case, the things are usually a lot more serious than the Jurgensen account not being filed by Friday, and more along the lines of unleashing an ancient evil who will overthrow the land. So you know what? Today, let's take a look at the mistakes of our virtual paragons and ask ourselves what we can learn to better improve our own lives, shall we? Yes, we shall. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 times you failed to be the hero in video games. So to kick this list off, I just need to say that I'll be covering choices on The Witcher 3 and its ending, and I know that certain people can be very particular over having this game spoiled, so skip on through if you don't fancy knowing more. Now, The Witcher 3 is one of the most perfect examples of a choice system done well, mainly because it doesn't always flag the choice to the player as being an obvious branching moment. It's less about making a clear good and evil decision and more gradual small choices that will affect the game in huge ways further down the line. Take, for example, Ciri, who is Big G's ward throughout the game, and through his teachings and by extension the player's own choices, she develops into a fine hunter herself. Well, that is if you make the right decisions, that is. When she asks for advice on how to manage her negativity, whether you choose to simply reassure her that she doesn't have to be good at everything, or even whether you choose to have a snowball fight with her, will all contribute to her ultimate fate at the end of the game. And never are these moments made clear to the player that they will have long-lasting repercussions. Plus, these decisions can, at times, be misleading as well. For example, late in the story, Ciri discovers that she's been wronged by a sorcerer and wants to trash his lab. Should you calm her down and convince her to refrain as a disciplined mentor would? Well, no, because that would weaken her resolve and may very well result in her death at the end, so it's actually better to trash the joint with her. Therefore, in just a few small decisions, you might end up failing to be the hero of the land because you failed to be the right example for her. Jesus, talk about pressure. Number 7. Unleashing the metalheads upon the world. Jak and Daxter, the Precursor legacy. So, while this event is not actually seen until Jak 2 Renegade, it's the actions of Jak and Daxter's first outing that sets up the disaster that they bring about. So, in the original game, once the player has collected 100 power cells, they gain access to a secret, and if I'm being totally honest, incredibly disappointing alternative ending in which a massive precursor gate opens, and then the cast look on through at the light, sequel-baiting the crap out of the whole event, and you get nothing for it. It's a waste of your time, don't bother doing it. Anyway, this gate turns out to be a rift, which is then opened come the second game, which then unleashes a massive robotic swarm of aliens and leads to the group being thrown into the dystopian police state known as Haven City. It's revealed later on in the game that Haven is actually built upon the ruins of Jak and Daxter's world, and it's here that you realise something. All of that heroing you did in the first game actually led to all of this happening, so you pretty much goosed yourself by trying to save the day. Worse still, when the characters meet a younger version of Samos the Sage and an infant child who is then revealed to be Jak himself, they then use the Rift Gate to send their younger selves back to before the events of the first game, thereby creating a stable time loop in which the world is eternally doomed forever to be overrun and conquered. But weirdly though, the game fails to acknowledge that this is a terrible thing. They are still allowing all of the death and destruction to happen no matter what, and that's not good. I mean, the devs clearly didn't want you to think about it too much because they rushed through this point and then just throw some fireworks at you to wow you into submission, but seriously, that's bad. Number 6. Looting and murder for simple survival. This war of mine. Based on the devastating real-life siege of Sarajevo, this war of mine is a powerful rumination on the civilian cost of war and one of the bleakest games you'll ever have the dubious honor of playing. Rather than filling the big stompy boots of the big lads shooting at each other, this war game has you control a group of civilian survivors as they attempt to make a home out of a bombed-out building and survive the siege without dying. And trust me, there are plenty of ways to die in this game. Things start simply enough, with the player controlling one of their characters as they scavenge abandoned houses and gas stations for baked beans and moonshine and whatnot. However, once all the empty buildings have been stripped down, you'll have to begin encroaching on areas occupied by other desperate, starving survivors with no less claim to the goods found within than you. Now, while some may be willing to trade, others will understandably be attached to their resources and can only be persuaded by, Well, less than heroic means, and by that I mean that you might have to beat someone to death with a pipe in order to get a damp box of cereal. It's a ruthlessly brutal game which takes every survival story that Hollywood has ever told you and asks you to think about the other people in this scenario. Just because you're the focus doesn't mean you're being heroic, and desperate situations lead to desperate choices. The question is, can you live with yours? Number 5. Leading your son down the very path you tried to protect him from. Red Dead Redemption. Red Dead Redemption, despite having been surpassed in scope and scale by its sequel, was Rockstar's true watershed moment. Their gripping, tragic tale of former outlaw John Marston on a violent adventure across the frontier to rescue his wife and son had more narrative clout than most cinematic outings of the time and pretty much left all other video games in the dust. Marston's mission to hunt down his former allies for a chance at a new life is his primary drive, but as you travel the deserts in search of these outlaws, you and he come to realize something. This isn't actually about him, this is about his wife and son. He will destroy everything that he once was in order to buy them a chance at the peace that he was never able to provide them. And we all know where this led to. The final betrayal by the government in order to tie up the final loose end. But at least he succeeded, right? He may have died, but at least his promise to provide peace was upheld. Well, it was, right up until the player takes control of his son. For you see, despite his love of reading and learning, Jack still wound up on a path of revenge because John failed to teach his son the most important thing. Violence begets violence, and the only way to break the cycle is to forgive. Jack might think himself free with his revenge now complete, but who's to say that there's not someone else now wronged who's now after him? Number 4. Perpetuating the apocalypse on a selfish whim. The Last of Us. Widely considered to be one of the finest video games ever made, The Last of Us, on the surface at least, feels like an optimistic, if unspeakably violent story of a grieving man finally able to find purpose again after losing his daughter. However, if we look at this with a slightly more critical eye, Joel's arc is significantly darker, as while we might think that we've saved Ellie from the hands of those who would harm her, what we've actually helped bring about is quite possibly the end of the human race. After their journey of bullets and bad puns, Joel learns that Ellie is immune to the virus, and the militant group that he's transporting her to plan to harvest her DNA to develop a cure, killing her in the process. However, Joel doesn't like the sound of losing his surrogate daughter, so he betrays and murders his way through them in order to save her. From one perspective, aka the way that the game frames itself, they say that this is a good thing, as it shows that Joel is now able to feel again. But if you step back from this narrative, this is awful. He's put humanity at risk in an unimaginably selfish way, as there is no other known carrier who is immune to the virus, and now the Fireflies are in disarray. He even barefaced lies to Ellie about this, telling her that there were many like her and that the procedures had never worked, when in fact, she was the first and only documented case. Some hero, right? Number 3. Bringing about the downfall of humanity. Half-Life. Gordon Freeman's first day at the barrel at Black Mesa gets off to a bad start when he's late for work, but a chewing out from his boss is the last of his worries as the events of Half-Life play out, because simply put, he brings about the complete subjugation and near extinction of humanity through the Resonance Cascade. In the aftermath of the Resonance Cascade, Gordon makes his way through the ruins of Black Mesa to the Lambda Complex, and finally an alien planet in order to eradicate the evil overlord who is compelling its forces to attack Earth. Once you've shown this brain baby the door, you might be tempted to put your feet up and relax knowing that you've saved the world. Well, get this, pal, you've actually just made it worse. It turns out that this only amplified the Resonance Cascade and has now allowed the Combine Empire to gather strength and invade Earth, conquering it in a matter of hours, all thanks to the fact that you were trying to put right what went wrong. Oh, aces. And to cap it all off, let's not forget that things weren't exactly left in the best of places at the end of episode 2, so things might even get worse the next time that Freeman is allowed to suit up, and that's if he's ever even given another chance at all. Number 2. Just about everything you do. Bioshock Infinite. Oh, Bioshock Infinite. It's a strange subject for me, as I absolutely loved the first 2 games, and while I did enjoy my time with the current last installment, it certainly wasn't as revolutionary as I wanted it to be. Instead of tight, twisting, barnacle-filled corridors, there was an open and airy feel which somehow felt even more constrictive, and instead of having my brain blown like your mother was doing the rounds on it, it felt like when she asked for a second date after the deed has been done and I say yes by accident, in that I found myself yelling, "This is a series of stupid and terrible decisions. What the hell did you think was going to happen? Although, to be fair, though, we did have a nice night, and I've never seen a person suck the meat off a chicken bone in one huff, so at least that was something. Anyway, point being, a lot of stupid things happen in Infinite, and a lot of them basically prevent you from doing anything heroic ever. When Booker first arrives in the city of Columbia, everything seems fine. Well, apart from, the massively horrible racist parade for total bastards that's going on. It turns out, though, that he's the man who has been prophesied to spell disaster for the place, and you know what? He does actually plunge things into disaster mere minutes of being there. He then agrees to help arm an underground civilian resistance in exchange for safe passage out, which is actually, pretty noble in itself. But when it turns out that the gunsmith they need to recruit is dead, Booker and Elizabeth resort to hopping between alternative timelines. This just brings about more chaos, though, and as the uprising becomes increasingly violent, it turns out that Comstock is an alternate version of Booker, who was baptized and then created Columbia as a religious zealot. Elizabeth then turns out to be Booker's daughter, and he sold her to the evil alternate version. You know what? I'm just going to stop it here because it is complicated to say the least. And you know what? It's utterly pointless because the solution to all of this is having Booker die at Elizabeth's hands over and over, basically ensuring that the game's events never happened. And when you look at it like this, what was the point of it all? And number 1, napalming civilian refugees and many, many other war crimes, Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops: The Line, also known as 101 Ways to Break the Geneva Convention, is an odd duck, as it somehow manages to deconstruct macho jingoistic modern military shooters while simultaneously wearing the skin of a macho jingoistic modern military shooter. But the important difference here is its narrative. Now, we all know about the white phosphorus scene by now, right? The moment where you deploy a devastating chemical bombardment on what first appears to be a large group of enemies, but ends up being a collection of civilians. It is without a doubt one of the most cutting moments in recent memory, and one that completely changes the angle from which you approach the title. Before this point, you were a gung-ho action man leading his team to wipe out the defectors of your force and win the day. But after this point, though, well, you're a war criminal. And it only gets worse. As Walker spirals into denial, his actions spiral out of control. And by the end of the title, you've not just condemned a group of innocents to death, but pretty much wiped your ass with the Geneva Convention. Heroes, it seems, as this list proves, are hard to come by. And there we go, those were 8 times that you failed to be a hero in video games. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. But before you go, my friends, and hopefully have a wonderful day, whatever you are getting up to, I just want to say one thing to you loud and proud. Be a hero to yourself. Treat yourself fairly, both physically and mentally. And I know that that's a hard thing to do sometimes because we can be predisposed to see only the negatives that are going on in our lives. But trust me, if you can take a step back from that, if you can evaluate things that you can and can't control, you might find that you are being way too hard on yourself. Give yourself a break. Take some time for yourself. And you know what? There is no shame in asking for help if you need that bit of energy from other people. Because then, other people can be a hero for you too. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me at RetroJ with a 0 over on Twitter. And as always, you have been awesome. Never forget that. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.